So great to see you again, Sean, after all this time, and thanks for giving up your time to do a quick update. First question, getting straight in there. How worried are you about Britain's food security and food supply in the sort of short to medium term?
I don't think you can separate Britain's food security situation from the world's food security situation. And we've certainly entered an era now when food security is a much greater concern for governments the world over, including the British government, than it was perhaps even just 5 years ago. Perhaps, during the middle of between 2010, 2020, after all the upheavals on world markets with prices at the end of the first decade of this millennium, maybe we thought we were getting back to low world prices. Maybe we were getting complacent. Well, that's all out of the window now. Long before the COVID or indeed the Russian-Ukrainian war, prices were beginning to rise on world markets. They weren't helped by COVID. They aren't helped by the Russian-Ukrainian war, but the underneath position is that there are more mouths to feed in the world and there isn't enough food to meet their demands, and therefore food security is the priority for the Food and Agricultural Organization, and it should be for us. We always thought as a rich country we could just import. If there was a problem, we could import. Well, we found out the hard way. First of all, we ended up with empty shelves for certain products and prices. Food inflation, well, it reached a peak of 19.1% earlier this year, and it's still very high, much higher, I might say, than our partners or ex-partners in the EU or indeed America. And the reason why inflation here is higher than anywhere in Europe or America is largely because of Brexit, and no one will talk about it. They will pretend it's everything else, but the effects of COVID are now in the rearview mirror. The Ukrainian-Russian war continues, but the rest of Europe and America is also subject to these pressures. Somehow or other, food prices are higher here than they are in those parts of the world.
And if you were Prime Minister, what would you do about it?
If I was I can see what we're in this ridiculous position now, where if you listen to government ministers, for instance, recently I've heard John Glenn, Secretary of State to the Treasury, and various other ministers interviewed because the Today programme, bless his cotton socks, is beginning to get back to its confidence, and it's beginning to ask ministers, isn't Brexit an influence here? Because they were silent on it most of the time. And last week when John Glenn was interviewed, he said something incredible. He said, well, the British people voted for this and we got to make the best of it. So it's all our fault, not theirs. The truth of the matter is that the government, sorry, I should say people like Rishi and probably Hunt and a few others are beginning to realise that they've got to get closer to Europe. They don't quite use the word, rejoin a single market or anything like that. That's still something they just can't bring themselves to talk about. But they talk about getting closer to Europe because they realise that outside the single market, any chance of what they want, economic growth, any chance of getting back to something more acceptable is really very unlikely. They know that in their hearts, and they don't really know what, they can't say, oh, we made a big mistake on Brexit, because that would guarantee they're going to lose the next election, which they're going to anyway. Labour can't say we really made a big mistake on Brexit, and what we've got to do is start to think about rejoining, because dear old Keir thinks he'll lose all the red wall seats if he does that. So we're in this never land where the thinking people realise we've made a terrible mistake. Thinking people realise it's going to have to be reversed, but no one knows how to start that process going. So we inch our way back towards Europe. You may have noticed, we had all this business. We were going to, get rid of all European legislation. We were going to have this act of parliament, which was going to make null and void any regulations from Europe which hadn't been debated and agreed. That's been dropped, in fact. I see the government are yet again delaying putting in place the trade barriers from stuff coming from Europe. Taking back control. They're desperate to do some deal with India now, and India says, you want to deal with us, matey, you're going to have to give a lot more visas to Indians. They thought they were going to control immigration. They completely lost control. I mean, the whole thing is an absolute farce, and we're a laughing stock in the world. And more to the point, as an economy, we're suffering. And actually, the parts of the economy that are suffering most are those that voted most heavily to leave. City of London is sort of crawling along, voted to remain, and is doing reasonably well, not as well as it might do, but it's those manufacturing businesses up north that are really suffering. They've been frozen out of European supply chains. They're finding it difficult to export to Europe. Very people that voted for a Brexit are being caught. And actually, my wife said to me yesterday, she was talking to some women, and she said, one of them said to her, we were misled over Brexit, which my wife interpreted that they voted for it. And we're now beginning to realise that this nirvana that they were promised was never a prospect. Brings us a long way from farming, but not really. I've always said farming was the sacrificial lamb, and farming is, I think, as the years go ahead, is going to find that Brexit is going to be very costly.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting because a lot of Remainers say no sympathy for farmers. You voted for it. Suck it up, Buttercup. I mean, obviously, not all of us voted for it. Many of us were vehemently against it. But ultimately, it's not us per se that suffers in a food crisis. It's the weakest and the poorest and the most vulnerable who suffer, and that's what we have to remember, because everyone apart from the super rich is impacted by hyperinflation, because with interest rates rising and everything else, things are becoming very, very difficult for families.
Yeah, and why are interest rates higher here than elsewhere? Because our economy is not in a very strong position, and it's in a weaker position than otherwise would be because of Brexit. So you can trace all this stuff back to Brexit. And our exchange rate is now about 15% lower than it was in 2016. That means you've added to inflation, and London School of Economics thinks, it's added about 6% to the cost of food, the exchange rate and the trade barriers. So, we've really let ourselves down. But there's another big fear I have, we're moving into this era of, it's variously called the fourth industrial revolution. They talk about it for agriculture as agriculture 4. It's all this, stuff about artificial intelligence, machine learning, internet of everything, etc. The point is that places like America and Europe are now pouring literally billions into research and development. We don't have the money to do it. We've cut ourselves off from Europe. We talk about perhaps £100 million might be found for this sort of thing. It's peanuts compared to them. We are in real danger of being left behind with the sort of technologies that are going to rule agriculture as well as other industries in the years ahead. We couldn't have cut ourselves off at a worse time, really. A new era is upon us. The world is reorganizing itself into East and Western blocks. They talk of bringing back supply chains, reshoring. Where are they coming back to? To the extent that they are able to come back from China and places like that, they will go to Europe. They won't come to us. And we've cut ourselves off from that. So whichever way you turn, this is not a happy picture.
So you've got your crystal ball, Sean. Tell me what you think is going to unfold over the next year or two. What can you see happening?
Uh,
More food shortages?
Well, bearing in mind, when it comes to my crystal ball, I never believed this country would vote to leave Europe. And I think in that I was probably aligned with most of those leaders of the Tory party who were asking people to
Well,
leave.
I
No
know
one
the
ever thought
report,
they had enough to do
that
it.
you wrote about no deal Brexit and the impact of that actually wasn't fearful enough, really, because everything that you wrote in that report has pretty much happened, and we did a deal. So
Well, we did almost the worst possible deal, short of walking away with no deal. Yeah, Boris just didn't care, and Frost is a complete nutter. But if I looked in my crystal ball, what I think might just happen, what I hope would happen, is that come the next election, the Tories are going to be defeated very heavily. Keir Starmer is going to come in and he's going to say, "Oh, we've got to get closer to Europe." All these sort of vague phrases. And after about a year or 2 years of trying to sidle up to Europe, he's going to be faced with the reality that unless he makes a serious step to rejoin the single market, nothing much will change. Maybe you'll get a deal on, veterinary inspections or something, but it's almost insignificant compared to the overall cost. And I think when that reality dawns, then we will begin to get a different narrative on Europe. We've had the last 5 years, everything about Europe is bad, we can't possibly, I'm so lucky to get away from them and all the rest of it. The tone changed with Rishi, in now having a little love fest with, the EU, and I think Keir Starmer will take that to the next level, because he'll have a party that I think are generally in favour of moving back towards a single market, and hopefully by then we'll have a very large majority in the country that will say Brexit didn't work, we made a mistake. Question then is whether Keir Starmer will actually have the nerve to go ahead without a referendum, or whether he'll feel he's got to go back with a referendum. If he has, that'll slow us down for another year or something. And he'll probably feel he does have to have another referendum. But I think that's what will happen.
yeah, and in those intervening years that takes, what happens to our food system?
Well, one might hope that in the next year or so, the Russian-Ukrainian war is brought to an end. So hope, no sign of it at the moment, because that is disturbing world food markets, etc. And we'll get back, hopefully, to greater stability on world markets. But I repeat what I said at the beginning: the underlying position in the world is that we're not producing enough food. Food security is still a major issue, and outside of Europe, we are more vulnerable on the food security front than we thought we were. And my second point is, of course, outside Europe, we just don't really have the sort of money in this country to invest in the technologies that are now beginning to be invested in by America on a huge level, and also by Europe. And therefore, I do fear that in 2 or 3 years' time, we'll be that much further behind than we otherwise would need to be. And if joined the single market in the future, we'll have a lot of catching up to do.
Yeah. And food supply in the interim, food just becomes more expensive and we're more prone to shocks of shortages.
Yes. You've got to remember, that the government like to talk in terms of inflation, as though when inflation's coming down, food prices are coming. Well, price of anything's coming down. Of course, it's not. If food prices are still rising at 10%, that may be lower than 19, but it still means they're 10% higher than they were last year. And the point is, even when, suppose when we get back to food inflation of 2%, say in 3 years' time or something, it still means at that point prices will be 30% higher or whatever. And it's off the top of my head. They didn't work it out, but it'd be about 30% higher than they were about 2 years ago, you know. So food has become much more expensive.
Yeah. What
And
I
will continue
find
to be.
extraordinary is that given the difficulties that particularly, greenhouse growers and chicken growers are having with energy costs, that the government has done absolutely nothing. So, the greenhouse growers that I know are not planting this winter.
I believe that's well, for a lot of them, that is the case. The government hasn't got the money. That's the reality. The government's, broke, and I suppose in desperation they would like to try to squeeze every penny they can to, I suppose, give a penny off income tax before the next election. Not going to make a scrap of difference to the result, I think, but I think that's what their name of their game is. And of course, the government, would like the supermarkets, I suppose, to come to some sort of agreement with the growers, because supermarkets have been a bit naughty. I think their profits, are actually increasing, so they're not suffering in the same way as their supply chain. And they made a terrible mistake at the start. Of course, they thought that they could get eggs and things from Italy, and that all wrong, and we had shortages of eggs, etc. I think, the long and short of all this is that you'll end up paying more money for poultry and eggs, and as well as other food products.
Yeah, it's scary.
And we do. We already have, food banks overwhelmed. People on lower incomes, their living standards are lower now than they were 10 years ago. We have no plan, no ability really to do anything about it in the short run. And
if they'd been serious about Brexit, what they should have done was underpinned it by making sure they invested in domestic production, because anyone surely could have worked out that Brexit was going to end up with inflation. I know world events have made it worse.
No. They believe. Sorry. First of all, a lot of them never believed they'd be in a position of doing it. But the zealots, as I call them, the headbangers, the Jacob Rees-Moggs of this world, they thought they would do a deal with America, Australia, New Zealand, and God knows who else, and import a lot of cheap food. That's what they thought was going to happen. That was their fantasy. And of course, it hasn't happened. And well, they've done a deal with Australia and moving towards one New Zealand, but it hasn't brought us cheap food. And if it does it will bring meat in here and dairy products in the coming years. But whether they'll just make it difficult for our farmers to supply, it won't greatly reduce the price of food. It'll just bring it down a bit from where it will be in 2 years' time, which is higher than it is today. No, it's the government had no plan for the economy. They had no plan for farming. They had no plan for anything. And you see that as around you. You're still waiting really for their post-Brexit agricultural policy. All this elm stuff seems to have gone to pot. Well, their experiments are all over the place. And what are we now? 6-7 years on since Brexit, and they still haven't got their act together.
Yeah, it's extraordinary though, because economists like Julian Jessup, full of the joys of spring, and say that Brexit is achieving whatever they thought it was going to achieve. But as to what that is, I'm quite confused. The only thing that looks to be a success is the immigration policy, bringing in more workers from the rest of the world. But we could have done that as part of the EU anyway. We could have changed the immigration policy as members of the EU.
Yeah, but that is most certainly not. If we want to be crude about it, I suppose there were some people who voted for Brexit in the belief that we should be an independent country and we should decide absolutely all our own rules and regulations. Some people might have believed that. There was perhaps a group of people who were just nostalgic and believed that if we left Europe, we'd somehow go back to the 1950s rather than the 1960s, a sick man of Europe. But let's be frank, an awful lot of people voted for Brexit because they were racists. And what they thought was by voting for Brexit, they would control immigration.
Yeah,
Has
I
it happened?
know.
None of it happened. And yeah, the I lost my train of thought there. Really, you pushed me off down, and I was trying to
I was
think
just
how
saying that as far
any
as I can see, the only positive thing
yes, sir,
that's
because
actually
they
helping
just
our
how
economy
an
is the immigration.
oh yeah, but that wasn't what was intended. That certainly wasn't what was intended. They did immigration here to keep our economy going, but it was not intended that we'd see these numbers of immigrants. And even worse than that, an awful lot of them we just put into sort of pseudo prisons at great cost to the taxpayer, rather than allowing them to help out with our shortages. I was trying to get to the back of my mind. How did you say Jessop's? What
Julian Jessup,
what is
yes,
the
he's one of the
benefit?
one of the
What,
vote leave economists. Well, one of Patrick Minford's
well,
friends.
oh, well, of course, I doubt, therefore, if he knows anything about trade, because Minford and his crew never had a trade economist amongst them. Then I think you have to turn to something called cognitive dissonance to explain what's going on here. It's this behavior that when the reality you thought doesn't occur, you just can't come to terms with it. So you try to you even double down. You see it with Trump, the supporters of Trump, the guy's a complete basket case, but they've doubled down and say, oh, everyone's turned against him. And I just can't take seriously any economist who says that we benefited from Brexit. It's just stupidity to say that. They could say, well, things didn't quite turn out as we expected. Maybe they shouldn't have expected those. But no one, I think, can say that Brexit is turning out as they expected. If this is what they expected, they should be taken out and shot, because it means they expected to make people poorer.
Well, perhaps they
No,
did.
seriously, no one in their right mind, even Farage, even that lunatic Farage says Brexit's
Says
failed.
it's
Of course, it's someone else's fault, not his. It could have been perfect. I mean, that guy really. The Brexit he wanted was to walk away. It would be even worse than it is now.
Well, the one thing,
but somehow,
Sean, that I'd say is that had we walked away when Johnson was first Prime Minister, that it would have been so bad that we would have ended up going straight back in, I think, because it would have been cataclysmic, and at least there wouldn't have been COVID and Ukraine war to, sort of have an extra cushion to blame, because it would have been obvious that Brexit had caused all of that chaos. That's the only thing that would have been good about no deal Brexit. It wouldn't have been a permanent reality. It couldn't have been.
well, yes, it would have been a disaster. But reading Anthony Seldon's book on Johnson at number 10, the one thing he says in there is Johnson knew from the word go he had to have a deal. So although he kept saying, oh, we'll walk away and all that, he never meant it, because even his lunatics around him realized it would be disastrous. So they did a deal, but it did almost the worst deal they possibly could, because of the ERG group. It's a lousy deal. We got next to nothing out of it other than the removal of tariffs. We're out of Horizon, we're out of Erasmus, we're out of Galileo, and now the government's desperate to get back into Horizon, things like that. They're trying to unpick the rubbish that Johnson didn't negotiate anyway. He left it to that idiot Frost, who, of course, like your friend Jessup, it's someone else's fault. It's all wrong now. Oh, we haven't taken advantage. I tell you that the guy
Frost was
should
a
be
rabid
put
Remainer until he was persuaded to be a Leaver. So it's hard to take it
well,
seriously.
just next time you hear it, it's cognitive dissonance, and it's this psychological effect that people have noticed when people make a big mistake in their life. Half the time they just can't accept it, so they double down on someone else's fault. It's not mine. It didn't turn out as should have. I know, and I just dismiss these people. Just dismiss them.
Yeah, it's tragic. So, final question then. Final roll of the dice. Do you think the next general election will be this autumn, or this winter, next spring, early summer, or the latest time possible next winter?
The experience would suggest that when government's in trouble, they wait to the last possible minute to go to the country. So that would suggest end of next year, early 2000. I think they can go to January 2025. Not sure about that, but I think they'll leave it to the last possible moment. The economy's not looking too good at the moment. I mean, we keep getting, my friend Mr. Hunt telling us it's resilient. The fact that it hasn't gone completely down the plug hole means we're resilient. The fact that we're not doing at all well is neither here nor there. The latest data is suggesting that things are beginning to, take a turn for the worse. There's high interest rates. The truth of the matter is, if you're going to squeeze inflation out of the economy, you've got to create pain, and the higher the rate of inflation, the more pain. And we've got that coming over the next 6 months. Just what the government thinks might help them, they'll probably have some more money, because one of the effects of all these wage rises and their freezing of the tax bands is they are getting more money in now via taxes. And I would guess they'll try to cut taxes by a penny or something before the next election. Some forlorn hope that people will forget everything then and vote for them. But they'll delay, I think, and they'll lose the next election, and it'll Keir Starmer will be a number 10 sometime early in 2025.
Okay, well, we'll have to revisit that and see if you're right. I think personally it depends what Cruella de Vil, as I call her, does. She might just force an early election. I think Sunak wants to go for as long as possible, but she's making moves, I think, and she's got little to lose.
You'd have to unseat Rishi, and I don't think that she's in a position to command sufficient support. There are, of course, headbangers still in the Tory party. It's amazing how silent they've been, and they're now, I believe, quite a small minority. I can't remember the last time I heard from Francois, for example, and one of the headbangers has crossed the floor, hasn't he, to is it a Reform Party or something?
Oh yes,
the potato man.
Yes, Bridgen, Andrew Bridgen, yes.
He's become a member of that Fox guy's party, isn't he? And crossed the floor. So he's not long. He'll go at the next election.
Yes, and we're still waiting for the by-election for Nadine Dorries, who's gone missing, who hasn't been in Parliament.
Now she's said that she is working as an MP. That woman is a scandal, and I think she'll be punished very heavily by the voters in her constituency just because of the way she's behaved, regardless of anything else. So she's utter contempt for them, as indeed she showed in her support for Brexit. These people never cared for anything but themselves, and she thought she was going to get herself in the House of Lords, and she's had a hissy fit because she didn't get it.
Yeah, we were saved that one at least, yeah. Well, thanks very much for your time. And
never mind, girl.
And we'll get together again soon. If there's a snap election, I'm pulling you back into Zoom, Sean, and we'll do another update.
Well, I can't believe there'll be a snap election, but well, if there is, let's hope that this time the farming industry gets its bread buttered on the right side.
Yeah, well, the farming vote is irrelevant. There's only a few of us left, but yeah, hopefully there's not too many Conservative boards all over the countryside next election.
Wouldn't do any harm for the leaders of the farming industry to say we were badly let down over Brexit.
Well, that might be a hope too far, Sean.
I think it might be for yes, because she's waiting for her damehood, isn't she? Yeah, so we all get caught on these things. But we'll see. In fact, if I'm right on my timetable, she probably won't be the leader of the NFU. She'll probably go next when they have the AGM, February, March, or whatever. And her successor might be a little more vocal on Brexit.
Yes, well, let's hope so. We certainly need it. Yeah, we definitely need it. So it's definitely, I think Brexit is definitely ramping up and getting bigger. It's like a jack in a box, and it's going to spring out everywhere and hard to put back in once it's out. Polls are already showing that.
We need people to talk about it. You know, we've had this conspiracy of silence. That is really, that is an insult to democracy. Democracy is supposed to be able to A, discuss things, A, change your mind if you think you've made a mistake, and this should be encouraged. We've had this conspiracy where the huge burden we placed on ourselves, we are just not allowed to talk about. And the media,
also,
like
mother-in-law sadly voted Brexit, which, was really contentious and difficult. But she passed away 3 years ago. And, it's been estimated about 4 million Brexit voters have passed away. And of course, millions of new ones have come in. So nothing is permanent. We didn't need to have a new vote on pro-EU because it wasn't an issue. Everything was working. But now we've even had King of Brexit admit that it's failed. Then it's ludicrous that we're not actually looking at revisiting it. And you've got Keir Starmer saying, no, we're staying out of the single market. I mean, it is cowardly, and I think it's undemocratic. The whole Labour Party, or pretty much all of them, are Remainers. And we're just carrying on with our heads in the sand, and we're in a lose-lose position. And if he gets into office and food is in a complete mess and there's considerable food shortages, he won't be in office for long. That's the other thing. He needs a food policy, and we need some grown-up thinking. We need some planning here.
Well, we're in all sorts of trouble if he doesn't change his mind after the next election. I'm only prepared to tolerate this ridiculous position he's got himself into, on we'll make Brexit better. Stupid phrase. Only in the belief that, once he gets into power, the reality will be you've got to join the single market or sunshine. I mean, he says his object is to generate the fastest rate of growth in GDP. He hasn't got a snowball hell's chance of doing that outside the single market. Probably hasn't even got a chance of doing it in the single market. He'll just make it he'll just make it easier to achieve faster growth by joining. And that's the reality. My hope.
It's disingenuous, isn't it? He's wanting to get in at any cost, and he's got to get to a point where he's honest with the electorate, because if he's intending to try to get back in the single market, then he needs to level with the country. Because if you win with a mandate without that position, I think you're in quite a sore place. And I think the EU are not going to take that seriously either, because they'll want to see a mandate for getting back out of Brexit.
I agree with you on that. I don't think the EU would entertain any such negotiations until they had pretty strong proof that the vast majority of people in this country wanted it, and it wasn't going to be another debacle. Having said that, an awful lot will depend on how post the election it is interpreted getting closer to Europe. If I can understand at the moment that if Keir Starmer, well, I think I can understand, if Keir Starmer said, we've got to get back into Europe, the Tories would immediately jump on him and say, you are telling the people who voted for Brexit they're idiots, and he just doesn't want that round his neck. So he's trying to stop that criticism. I believe this is what's going on. I may be completely wrong. He wants to stop the Tories from being able to say that. So he talks about this vague thing of getting close to Europe, but doesn't set out what it do, hopes that the Red Wall will come back and vote for him, and hopes the Tories will lose seats to the Lib Dems down south, etc. He'll get his overall majority, and then he'll start. And Europe will say, dodgy here, sunshine, you know, you're going to have to be more honest with your people. And I say it won't happen overnight. You know, maybe it'll take Keir going to Europe and being rebuffed before he comes back and says, well, we've got to do something.
Yeah, in the meantime, we're all getting poorer and weaker, and yeah.
The whole country's getting poorer. The whole country's getting poorer. That's what Brexit did, made us poorer.
Yeah. Well, I remember speaking to one lorry driver who was delighted at the thought of having less food choice. He was furious. He voted Brexit because he was furious with having so much choice in the supermarket. So there will be some happy Brexit people with what is delivered. But they're few and far between. And the polls are showing now, 61 was yesterday, YouGov, 64% now admit that Brexit was wrong.
Oh, yeah. Oh, it's growing. There's no doubt about that. And it will go on growing because there's no shining light on the hill or whatever.
Starmer's got to turn around and say, well, actually, I'm speaking to the people that have changed their mind. You know, polls are showing us this, you know. And so what the Conservatives will have a go at him, irrespective on anything. So it's best to level with the people and give them.
I'm still reflecting on that lorry driver. They voted for Brexit because there was too much choice. I mean, I'm reminded, you know, of Winston Churchill, who said, you know, the only thing wrong with democracy is the people who vote.
You know, he was furious about it. He said, how can we have why do we need to have so many different items in the supermarket? So, you know, he wanted to go back to when we were scratching around and having to go out and shoot a rabbit because there's not enough food. Yeah. So great. There's not even that many rabbits around anymore. Anyway, good to see you, Sean, and we'll chat again soon.
Okay, then.
Thanks for your time.
I'm going to leave now. Okay. Cheers. Bye.